Now we move to part 2 of defective contracts. Unenforceable contracts. According to Article 1403, the following contracts are unenforceable unless they are ratified. First, number 1, those entered into the name of another person by one who has been given no authority or legal representation or who has acted beyond his powers. Number 2, those that do not comply with statute of frauds as set forth in this number. In the following cases, an agreement hereafter made shall be unenforceable by action unless the same or some note or memorandum thereof be in writing and subscribed by the party charged or by his agent. Evidence therefore of the agreement cannot be received without in writing or a secondary evidence of its contents. Number 1, or letter A, an agreement by its term is not to be performed within a year from making thereof. Letter B, a special promise to answer for the death, default, or miscarriage of another. Letter C, an agreement made in consideration of marriage other than a mutual promise to marry. Letter D, an agreement for the sale of goods, chattels, or things in action at a price not less than 500 pesos unless the buyer accept and receive part of such goods and chattels or the evidences or some of them of such things in action or pay at the time some part of the purchase money. But when a sale is made by auction, an entry is made by the auctioneer in his sales book at the time of the sale of the amount and kind of property sold, terms of sale, price, names, and purchases, or person whose account the sale is made, it is sufficient memorandum. E, an agreement of the leasing for a longer period than 1 year or for the sale of real property or of an interest therein. Okay? So you have to understand the Articles 1403 pero give special attention to number 1 and number 2, letter A, letter B, letter C, and E. Okay? Ang titignan lang natin dyan, dun sa letter D, is yung sale of goods and chattels. Kung titignan nyo, 500 pesos. Anyway, yun yung mga kailangan yung intindihin. First of all, what do you mean by unenforceable contracts? Unenforceable contracts are those that cannot be enforced in court or sued upon by reason of certain defects provided by law unless they are ratified according to law. What is the major defect na sinasabi natin sa unenforceable? Ito yung tinatawag natin na hindi siya written. So, dapat written. So, very clear ang ating unenforceable contracts. Ibig sabihin, kahit paano, it should be written because of that defect. Ano yung binding force ng unenforceable contract? While it is rescissionable and voidable contracts are valid and enforceable unless they are rescinded or annulled. Unenforceable contracts, although valid, are unenforceable in court unless they are cured or ratified. Once ratified, these contracts may then be enforceable. So, hindi mo pa siya pwedeng i-enforce. So, pag na-ratify at nasabing valid siya, na-cure, then that's the only time you can say that the contract should be enforced. So, ito na, ang explanation natin. Those entered into the name of another by one without acting in the excess of authority, those do not comply with the statute of frauds. Those where both parties are incapable of giving The above contracts indicate the three types of defects that render them unenforceable. Okay? Yung sinasabi nating tatlo, class, ito yung mga defects. Okay? Number 1, kailangan dito written, na ratify. Hindi naman basta-basta lang written. The word siguro, the best that describes this defect is they should be ratified. Okay? Pag sinabi mong halimbawa, yung those entered into the name of another by one without an acting in excess of authority. So kung yung nagbigay ng authority, the principal, yung nagbigay ng authority do sa isang tao, kung hindi naman siya umangal, that is already a clear ratification of his action, giving an excess power to the person being authorized. On the other hand, pag sinabi mo namang those do not comply with the statute of frauds, ito yung mga agreement na dapat nakalista. Okay? Ito yung mga written, di pala nakalistan, written. It should be written. Kasama rito yung sales of goods, chattels, or things in action at a price not less than 500 pesos. Okay? At yung number 3, those where both parties are capable of giving consent to a contract. Okay? Number 3. So, kung halimbawa both parties are incapable, they are unenforceable. Pero pag yung isa lang, voidable. Tandaan nyo ha? Pag yung isang incapable lang of giving consent, isang tao lang, that is voidable. Pero pag dalawa na, incapable of giving consent, then it is already unenforceable. The reason behind, in pare delicto, pareho silang may mali. Diba? Okay. Meaning of untought authorized contracts are those entered into in the name of another person by one who has given no authority or legal representation or has acted beyond his powers. Yan yung ating unauthorized contract. So, paano gagawin dyan? I-ratify nung principal. Okay, number 2, ano naman ibig sabihin ng statute of frauds? Ito kasi may history itong statute of frauds nito eh. Kasi parang nung unang panahon, class, ito yung paraan to counter yung ating mga evil practices that are giving false testimony. So, it attempted to deal with the prevalence of a successful perjury by making specified contracts unenforceable unless evidenced in a prescribed manner. And that is written. Okay? Para maiwasan yung mga panloloko. That is the very purpose of statute of frauds, to prevent fraud, but also to guard against the mistakes of honest men by requiring that certain agreements that are susceptible to fraud, it should be written, it should be in writing. Otherwise, unenforceable by action of the court. Okay? So that is statute of fraud. So ano yung mga example na yon? Bigyan natin ng example. Agreement not to be performed within 1 year from the making thereof. Halimbawa, on October 10, 2021, si S entered into an oral contract with B for the construction of B's house to begin on October 20, 2022. The contract must be in writing to be enforceable. Okay? Kasi may agreement sila. So, October 10, 2021, dapat pumasok sila sa kontrata, tapos mag-start yung construction October 2022. So, dapat yon in writing to be enforceable. Another thing, promise to answer for the debt, default, or miscarriage of another. Si debtor, example, debtor owes creditor 50,000 with guarantor, si G. Here, si guarantor has a special promise to answer for the debt of the debtor in case debtor fails to pay the same. Again, this promise is unenforceable unless it is in writing na pinirmahan ni guarantor. Okay? What else? Agreement in consideration of marriage other than the mutual promise to pay. M. Male agrees to build a house worth 1 million pesos for wife W if will marry M. This must appear in writing to be enforceable unless M ratifies the agreement. The statute applies even when the promise to build the house is made by a third person. So, pwede yun. Dapat susulat. Ito na yun. Ito yung hindi pwede. But a mutual promise of M and W to marry each other need not be in writing. For the breach of mutual promise to marry, the injured party may prove the promise of oral evidence in an action for damages. Kasi hindi pa pwedeng isulat ang pangakong magpakasal. Pwedeng baguhin unless, class, to tandaan nyo ha, meron ng mga na-incur na damages doon sa babae o kung sino man ang hindi tumupad, pwede niyan singilin. Pero hindi mo pa pwedeng ipa-enforce, no, nangako ka sa aking ipakasal or nangako ka sa aking makasal. Hindi pa pwede, class. Tandaan nyo ha, ang mutual promise to pray, to marry, ang mutual promise to marry is not enforceable. Okay? Agreement for the sale of goods at a price not less than 500. Seller and buyer mutually agreed to sell and buy a piano at the price of 12,000 pesos. Okay? So since it's malaki sa 500, this must be in writing to be enforceable. Okay? Same with leasing for a longer period than 1 year. So kung sino may-ari dyan ng apartment, tandaan nyo, pag more than a year ang inyong usapan, it should be in writing. Pag may pinapaupahan kayo. Same with the sale of real property or merong interest. Hindi pa pwedeng oral sale lang. Dapat dyan in writing. Okay? Representation as to the credit of a third person. Example, si debtor is seeking a loan from creditor. Si T represents to creditor that the debtor is solvent and has a good credit reputation. Relying upon this representation, si creditor extends a loan to debtor who actually is insolvent. The representation of T, which was made to introduce the extension of credit to D, must be in writing. So dapat pag ikaw ay nagbibigay ng representation sa isang tao, lalo na kung nangungutang, it should be in writing. Okay? So ganun lang yung class. Sisimplihan lang natin ang ating unenforceable contract. Now we move to void or inexistent contracts. Ako, class, sa totoo lang, hindi siya defective. Okay? Kasi pag sinabi mong void, wala na, inexistent na, hindi na nag-i-exist, hindi na siya maku-cure. So memorize nyo, class, itong enumeration provided in Article 1409 para wala ng argument with regard to void contracts or inexistent contracts. But for the sake of our studies, it is part of defective contracts. So what are the following contracts which is void from the beginning? Those whose cause, object, or purpose is contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. That is self-explanatory now. Number 2, those which are absolutely simulated or fictitious. Yung mga kontratang gawa-gawa lang. So, given na rin yun. Those whose object or cause did not exist at the time of the transaction. Yes, of course. If there is, if the contract, the following requisites, dapat merong cause, object, at wala itong dalawa. So, void na yung kontrata natin. Number 4, those whose object is outside the commerce of men. O, bakit ka magkakaroon ng contract kung yung object ng kontrata ay outside the commerce of men? So, hindi na siya nag-i-exist. It is a void contract. Number 5, those which contemplate an impossible service. Ano yung mga impossible service? Diba? Yung mga napag-usapan natin na bibigyan kitang pera, hawakan mo lang ang araw. That is an impossible service. Number 6, those where the intention of the parties relative to the principal object of the contracts cannot be ascertained. Kung hindi ma-discover o hindi man lang maliwanag ano ba ang intensyon ng mga parties para doon sa principal object. Tandaan nyo, class, kung hindi maliwanag ang usapan at hindi ito mare-reform, hindi mailabas ang intent, then it is a void contract. Okay? And of course, number 7, those expressly prohibited or declared void by law. These contracts cannot be ratified, neither can the right to set up the defense or illegality be waived. Very clear tayo doon, class. So, for reiteration, ano bang ibig sabihin ng void contracts? Void contracts are those which, because of certain defects, generally produces no effect at all or produce no effect at all. They are considered as inexistent from its inception or from the beginning. The expression void contract is therefore, however, the expression is often loosely used to refer an agreement tainted with illegality. Okay? Illegality. So the expression void contract malabo kasi dapat ito may mali talaga, so hindi siya nag-i-exist. Kung ako tatanungin nyo, class, inexistent ang mas appropriate because it refers to agreement which lack one or some of all the elements and do not comply with formalities which are essential for the existence of a contract. An illegal contract may produce effects under certain circumstances where the parties are not of equal guilt. What are the characteristics of a void or inexistent contract? Para mas malalo nating maintindihan, generally, it produces no force and effect whatsoever. Wala talaga siyang effect. It cannot be ratified. Dahil nga siya ay void at hindi mo siya pwedeng i-ratify. The right to set up the defense of illegality cannot be waived. O pag sinabi mong, ay kahit illegal yan, sige pinapayagan ko na. Hindi pa pwede yun, class. Illegal is illegal. Mali is mali. The action or defense for the declaration of its existence does not prescribe. Ibig sabihin, kahit anong tagal, pag mali is mali. Kaya yung mga maling birth certificate, yung sinasabi nating fictitious, saka simulation, yung gawa-gawa ng mga birth certificate, hindi nagpe-prescribe yun, class. Ibig sabihin, hindi na papanis. Mali is mali. Yan ang mga tatandaan nyo. Okay? The defense of illegality is not available to third person whose interests are not directly available. Okay? It cannot give rise to a valid contract. Ngayon, kung void siya, kahit anong gawin, class, kaya nga nasa, it cannot be ratified. So, ibig sabihin nun, it will not rise or it will not give rise to being a valid contract. Okay, so what are the instances of a void or inexistent contracts? As mentioned in 1409, contracts whose cause, object, or purpose is contrary to law. Natin, ang pag-ianahan natin. Contracts which are absolutely simulated, gaya ng bigay kong example. Okay? Contract without cause or object. Okay? Ano pa? Those objects outside the commerce of man. Contracts which contemplate an impossible service. Inuulit ko lang, class, kasi this is important. Contracts where the intention of the parties relative cannot be ascertained. Contracts expressly prohibited or declared void by law. Ano yung ito yung mas kailangan nyo maintindihan. Number 7. Ano ba yung mga contracts expressly prohibited or declared void by law? Yung contracts of future inheritance. Hindi pa pwede yun, class. Okay? Unless authorized by law. Generally, hindi pa pwede. Sale of property between husband and wife. Okay? Hindi pa pwede yun. Walang kontratang ganun. Except, pag separation of property yung kanilang napili. Next, purchase of property by persons who are specially disqualified by law. O, hindi pa pwede yung purchase of property. Kasi like example dito yung guardians and wards. Yung guardian ng isang bata, hindi niya pwedeng bilhin yung property ng kanyang inaalagaan na bata. Kasi siya, class, meron siyang undue influence over the kid. Kasi siya nag-aalaga, tapos siya yung bibili. Class, that is not allowed. That is very, very mali, and it is inexistent. Okay? And it is void. So, that wraps up our topic for contracts. I hope you learned a lot, and good luck with your exams. For any questions, message me. Take care, stay safe.